When people look at synastry, the major aspects tend to get all the attention. These are the ones where the dramatic chemistry exists. But a relationship is not only its dramatic moments. It also has a texture, a quality that runs through the ordinary unremarkable days, the low-level friction that appears for no obvious reason, the creative spark that shows up when you're working on something together, the strange feeling of being slightly but consistently off from each other in one specific area. These qualities often can't be traced to the major aspects. They belong to the minor ones. Minor aspects don't usually announce themselves. They're more often felt as patterns, the recurring small annoyance, the particular way two people find unexpected creative solutions together, the dynamic that almost resolves but keeps coming back. Once you know what to look for, they become some of the more precise and informative elements of a chart comparison. Minor aspects are not destiny. They describe tendencies in how two people's energies interact, not fixed outcomes. The semi-sextile connects two planets that have nothing structurally in common. Different element, different modality, different orientation. It's the equivalent of two people who grew up in completely different environments, speak different relational dialects, and happen to live next door to each other. This minor aspect is subtle enough that many people never name it, even when they're experiencing it. It doesn't feel like conflict. It feels more like a persistent low-level sense of being slightly out of sync in a particular area, like you're each operating on your own internal logic and those logics run parallel to each other without quite connecting. You're both present, both trying, and still something in that domain doesn't quite land. There's no drama. It just takes more effort than it seems like it should. The semi-sextile can build a specific kind of tolerance, the capacity to function well alongside someone who genuinely operates differently than you do in a given area. Over time, and with conscious effort, two people with this aspect can develop a working translation between the different frameworks. It's not the same as natural resonance, but it is a real skill, and relationships that develop it tend to be more adaptable in general. If the rest of the chart is strong, this aspect tends to fade into the background, manageable background noise rather than a defining feature. The difficulty is that the effort required is invisible. Because nothing is overtly wrong, neither person may ever think to name the dynamic or examine it. The energy goes into continuous micro-adjustment, the constant small work of bridging the gap, and that work accumulates without being recognized or acknowledged. In long-term relationships, this quiet effort can become a quiet drain. The semi-sextile doesn't usually cause crises. It just makes one area of the connection consistently more work than it looks like from the outside. The semi-quintile, sometimes called the decile, belongs to the same creative family as the quintile, but in a smaller, more specific form. Think of the quintile as a broad creative wavelength two people share, and the semi-quintile as a very narrow frequency within that, a single precise channel where something particular can happen between them. This minor aspect tends to be almost invisible until a specific context activates it. In day-to-day interaction, you may not notice anything distinct. But put both people in a particular setting, a creative project, a technical problem, a niche shared interest, and something clicks in that area in a way that's hard to explain. There's a specific kind of ease or spark in that narrow domain that neither person produces as readily on their own or with anyone else. It's a small thing, but it's genuinely theirs. When two people find or create the right context for this aspect to operate, it produces a quality of quietly exceptional collaboration in that specific area. The semi-quintile is often what explains why two people who aren't obviously suited as creative partners produce something surprisingly good together in one particular domain. It's the unexpected specialization, the band that sounds better live than anyone predicted, the research partners whose niche overlap turns out to be exactly what the project needed. Small, but often memorable when it activates. The semi-quintile's primary limitation is that it requires activation. Without the right context, it may simply never show up. You can have this aspect in a chart comparison and never consciously experience its effect, particularly if the relationship doesn't naturally create space for that kind of collaboration. It doesn't create problems, it just waits. And if the conditions never arise, it never contributes. The semi-square carries the same friction as a square but at lower intensity and without the square's built-in urgency. Where a full square between two planets creates enough heat to force a response, the semi-square produces a smaller, more persistent irritation. Not a fire alarm, more like a dripping tap you keep meaning to fix. This aspect tends to show up as the thing you can't quite put your finger on. A recurring small tension in a particular area of the relationship. The minor friction that appears, again and again, in a form just mild enough that it never quite prompts a real conversation. It doesn't feel like a fight, it feels like the low hum of something that grates. And because it's never dramatic enough to force a reckoning, it tends to just keep happening. The same small collision, slightly different shape each time. Unlike some friction aspects, the semi-square is manageable with awareness. Once both people recognize the pattern, the specific area where this recurring small tension lives, they can develop strategies for handling it before it compounds. Some couples turn it into something almost affectionate. The known territory of this is the thing we always bump against here, named and navigated with enough lightness that it stops eroding goodwill. The aspect doesn't disappear, but it loses much of its wearing quality once it's no longer operating below the level of awareness. The primary risk is accumulation. Each individual instance of the tension is too small to warrant a response, but the pattern doesn't stop. Over months and years, the repeated small frictions build into something that can genuinely erode the relationship's emotional bandwidth, a kind of weariness that's hard to trace back to a cause because no single event was significant enough to remember. The semi-square is most damaging when it's left unexamined, allowed to run as background noise until the background noise becomes the atmosphere. The quintile belongs to a series of aspects associated with creative intelligence, the capacity to make something original, to solve problems in ways that aren't obvious, to produce output that has its own distinct fingerprint. In Synastry, the quintile marks an area where two people's energies, when combined, generate something genuinely creative that neither could access as easily on their own. This aspect tends to feel less like a relational quality and more like a productive one. In the domain it governs, there's a specific quality of generative click, the idea that arrives when you're talking it through together, the creative solution that shows up because of the combination of these two particular minds. It can be subtle. You might just notice that things in that area work unusually well between you, that you think better or produce better when the other person is involved. It doesn't necessarily feel like magic, it often just feels like a very good fit in a specific register. At its most visible, the quintile produces genuine co-creative output. The work that is distinctly better for having been done together. The project that has a signature that belongs to the partnership rather than to either individual. But it doesn't require formal creative collaboration to be valuable. In daily life, it can show up as an unusual ability to solve problems together in ways that surprise both people, the solution that neither would have reached alone. This is one of the aspects that tends to be most appreciated in retrospect. You recognize its contribution when you try to produce the same quality of output independently and find it harder. The quintile's limitation is that it's domain-specific. It operates in the area its particular planet combination governs, and it doesn't automatically transfer elsewhere. Two people with a quintile in the intellectual or creative domain may find that their collaboration in that area far exceeds what they can produce in other areas of the relationship. If the relationship leans heavily on the quintile without having other supporting contacts, there can be a gap between the quality of what they create together and the quality of how they actually relate to each other day to day. The Sesquiquintile in Synastry, also called the tridecile, is a further expression of the quintile family, but with a specific twist. Where the quintile tends to generate creative output in stable conditions, the sesquiquintile activates most distinctly when things are in motion, under pressure, or in the middle of change. It's the aspect of the adaptive solution, the creative response to the unexpected. This minor aspect tends to be most noticeable when the relationship is navigating difficulty or transition. In ordinary settled circumstances, it may operate quietly, showing up as a particular quality of ease in how two people find their way through disagreements or obstacles. Under pressure, it becomes more distinct. There's an ability to improvise together that feels almost instinctive, a capacity to come up with approaches to problems that are specific to the two of you and wouldn't occur to either of you alone. It also tends to produce the relationship's private language, the inside references, the shared shorthand, the way of navigating each other that is entirely your own. The sesquiquintile is one of the aspects that tends to improve a relationship's quality during difficult periods. The creative adaptability it generates means that challenges are more likely to be met with resourcefulness than with paralysis. Couples with this aspect in their synastry often describe finding unexpected support in each other during major life transitions, not through conventional wisdom, but through solutions that arise from the specific combination of who they each are. Over time, this builds a particular quality of confidence in the relationship's resilience. Because this aspect activates most clearly under pressure, it may be less visible, or feel less relevant, during periods when life is relatively stable. If the relationship hasn't yet been tested, it may seem like a minor or unremarkable contact. There's also a risk that the specific, idiosyncratic logic the sesquiquintile generates between two people can become difficult to explain or justify to anyone outside the relationship, which can occasionally create friction with people in each other's broader lives who don't share the same internal frame of reference. The Sesquiquadrate in synastry has the square's friction but without the square's built-in urgency toward resolution. The result is a specific kind of relational difficulty, the problem that keeps coming back, that almost gets solved, and then circles around again. This minor aspect tends to feel like a particular kind of frustration, the sense that you've nearly worked something out, that you're right on the edge of resolving a recurring dynamic, and then somehow you're back at the beginning. The dynamic in question often feels familiar within the relationship, something you've discussed before, something both of you recognize, something that hasn't quite clicked into place despite repeated attempts. It's not necessarily painful, it can just feel persistently unfinished. What the Sesquiquadrate can build, when it's approached with awareness, is a specific kind of patience and strategic thinking. Because the usual approaches keep falling short, both people eventually have to get more creative and more honest about what is actually happening in that area. This forced creativity, the willingness to try something genuinely different after the obvious approaches haven't worked, can occasionally produce insights that wouldn't have been reached without the resistance. The aspect rarely resolves cleanly, but it can produce a mature, self-aware relationship with the pattern itself. The central difficulty is the cycle. The Sesquiquadrate tends to produce progress that doesn't hold, movement toward resolution that reverses before it completes. When this happens repeatedly, it can produce a specific kind of relational discouragement, the feeling that this particular thing between you simply cannot be fixed, without quite knowing why. If neither person finds a way to step back and see the pattern rather than repeatedly engaging with each individual instance of it, the cycle can run indefinitely, draining energy without producing change. The biquintile is the most developed and refined expression of the quintile family in synastry. Where the quintile generates original ideas and the sesquiquintile produces adaptive solutions, the biquintile represents what happens when creative collaboration between two people has matured, when the work has been refined, deepened, and developed into something more sophisticated than its original form. This aspect tends to be most noticeable in relationships that have accumulated some shared history. It produces a specific quality of deepening mutual appreciation, not general admiration, but the particular regard that comes from watching someone you know well operate at a high level, over time, in ways that continue to surprise and interest you. In the domain it governs, there's a sense that your understanding of each other keeps becoming more precise and more genuinely engaged, rather than settling into familiarity. The other person remains intellectually interesting in that area in a way that doesn't require novelty to sustain it. The biquintile's primary contribution is to the long-term quality of creative and intellectual engagement within a relationship. It's one of the aspects most associated with sustained mutual fascination, the ability to remain genuinely interested in each other's minds and capabilities across years. In relationships with shared creative or intellectual projects, it tends to function as a refinement engine, both people naturally returning to the shared work, improving it, finding more elegant versions of what they first produced. This is one of the quieter but more genuinely sustaining aspects in long-term partnerships. The biquintile requires time and shared context to become visible. In newer relationships, or in relationships that don't create space for the kind of collaboration it supports, it may not register at all. Its contribution is to depth and refinement rather than to initial spark, which means it's an aspect that becomes more valuable as a relationship develops, and less useful as a point of early attraction or connection. It also, like all quintile family aspects, operates within a specific domain rather than across the whole relationship. The quincunx, also called the inconjunct, is an aspect between two planets that share absolutely nothing: different element, different modality, different polarity. They don't speak the same language and have no structural basis for negotiation. This isn't about conflict, it's about a more fundamental kind of misalignment, an incapacity to interface. There's a persistent sense of being slightly off from each other in ways that are genuinely hard to explain or fix. It's not an argument, it's more like continuously arriving at the same point from different directions and finding that neither path leads where you both need to be. You adjust, the other person adjusts, the adjustment doesn't quite resolve it, you adjust again. This recalibration is ongoing, not because either person is doing something wrong, but because the frameworks involved simply don't have a natural meeting point. Over time, it can also show up physically, a quality of low-level strain or effort in that domain, even on otherwise good days. It's not dramatic, it's just there. The quincunx can build a genuine capacity for flexibility. Because there is no easy resolution, both people are pushed to develop more range in how they navigate that area than they would have needed with a more compatible contact. Over years, this can produce a specific kind of relational adaptability, a comfort with operating across genuine difference that is, in its own way, a real asset. People who have navigated significant quincunx contacts together often describe a specific resilience, the knowledge that they can function well even when things don't align neatly, because they've been doing exactly that. The primary difficulty is that the quincunx doesn't resolve. This is not a dynamic that with the right conversation or the right insight clicks into place. The structural incompatibility is permanent. What can change is each person's relationship to the dynamic, from frustrated by it to accepting of it, from repeatedly fighting the same pattern to recognizing it as a known feature of the terrain and managing it with more grace. But managing it requires ongoing effort. Unlike a square, which can produce growth that moves the relationship to a new place, the quincunx tends to ask for the same adjustment, again and again, indefinitely. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.